Most people think the most important moment in investing is the day you hit $100,000. I understand why. 100,000 looks serious. It sounds respectable. It feels like a number the world is willing to honor. Friends understand it. Your own mind understands it. For the first time, the account no longer feels like a hobby, a side effort, or a hopeful little experiment you are trying to run in the background of ordinary adult life. But if you stay around money long enough, and if you study what actually changes the quality of a person's financial life, you begin to notice that the moment that matters most is often much quieter than the milestone everyone celebrates. It is not when you pay off the car. It is not when you finally max out the retirement account one year. It is not when your portfolio statement becomes impressive enough to screenshot. It is the moment your retirement becomes inevitable. That is the phrase I want you to sit with. Inevitable. Not possible. Not maybe. Not dependent on whether you can keep being perfect for another 30 years. I mean the moment when the machine is strong enough that even if you never added another dollar time and compounding, would still carry you to a workable retirement on schedule. If that sounds like cheating, that is because most people never hear about it properly. If that sounds too good to be true, that is because the public is trained to think of retirement as one endless grind that stops only when you are old enough to be tired of hearing the word compound. I do not think that is the right mental model. I think it is a poor model, and poor models create poor behavior. I have spent most of my life around capital, businesses, markets, and the peculiar emotions that money creates in otherwise sensible people. And if there is one thing I wish the average investor understood far earlier, it is this. There are two engines in every investing life. The first engine is your contributions. The second engine is compounding. At the beginning, the first engine does almost all the work. That is the part people hate they save. They invest, they check the account, and the result feels insulting. The number moves, yes, but not enough to flatter the sacrifice. The person tells himself he is doing something responsible, but nothing in the current balance feels large enough to command respect. That is where the mind begins making trouble. The mind whispers, "This is too slow." The mind says, "Maybe I started too late." The mind says, "But I need something faster." The mind says, "Maybe I should wait until I have more money, more certainty, more time, more confidence, a better market, a better job, a calmer life." That whisper is expensive. It ruins more futures than recessions do. Not because people are lazy, because they are misreading the phase. The public thinks compounding begins with visible growth. It does not. Compounding begins with disappointment. It begins with the humiliating stretch, where effort and visible reward do not appear to match. That is not a flaw in the process. That is the process. The small balance cannot generate a large visible return, no matter how noble your intentions are. The early years are contribution years. That is, and reality always deserves more respect than mood. When I was young, I learned that the first dollars matter disproportionately, not because they are numerically large, but because they prove identity. A person who can save and invest when the account is still too small to flatter him is building something much more important than a number. He is building a self. He is becoming the sort of person who buys his future, whether or not the future. That is an underrated skill. Most people only behave well financially when recent results are rewarding enough to keep them emotionally interested. That is not discipline. That is a short contract with motivation. I do not trust motivation very much. Motivation is seasonal. Structure is better. A good structure keeps working when the account looks too small, when the market looks ugly, when the year feels chaotic, and when the headlines try to convince you that your little habit cannot possibly matter against forces so large. That is why I like simple systems so much. A broad index fund, automatic contributions, a fixed review schedule instead of constant checking, a target that can be written down and understood. Those things sound boring. Good boring is often what works. The world keeps trying to sell excitement because excitement is easier to market than discipline. Discipline does not photograph well. Excitement does. That is why the average investor keeps getting offered speed and novelty when what he really needs is patience and arithmetic. Now, the two engines do not stay unequal forever. This is where the subject gets interesting. At first, contributions carry the whole burden. Then there comes a middle period where the portfolio begins helping in a way that is finally visible. Then there comes a later period when the portfolio begins doing more work than you do. That first major shift is what I would call the crossover point. The crossover point is one of the most useful ideas in personal finance because it gives shape to what otherwise feels like one long, miserable uphill march. The definition is simple. It is the moment your portfolio's annual growth exceeds your annual contributions. That is all. But do not let the simplicity fool you. That moment changes the emotional experience of investing in a very deep way. Up until then, you are dragging the machine. After that, the machine is pulling with you. You stop feeling like the sole engine. You are no longer the only worker in the factory. Your capital has joined the labor force. That is not a poetic way to say it. That is literally what the arithmetic means. Let us make it concrete with round numbers, because round numbers help the mind feel structure. Suppose you are investing $20,000 per year into broad American index funds. Nothing exotic, no leverage, no heroics, just disciplined ownership of productive business. Now let us assume a long-run average return of 7%. Not because the market owes you exactly 7% every year, it does not. Some years will be far worse, some much. I use 7 because it keeps the arithmetic clear and roughly reasonable at $100,000 invested. 7% growth is $7,000. That is meaningful, yes, but it is still much smaller than your $20,000 contribution. You are the engine. At $300,000 invested, 7% growth is $21,000. Now the machine has arrived at parity with you. You and the portfolio are doing roughly equal work. That is psychologically enormous. At $500,000 invested, 7% growth is $35,000. Now the portfolio is doing substantially more work than your annual savings. You still matter, of course, but you are no longer carrying the narrative. At $1 million invested, 7% growth is $70,000. At that point, a $20,000 contribution still helps, but it has become emotionally small relative to what the capital itself is capable of doing in a decent year. That is why people say the process gets easier. What they mean is not that discipline becomes effortless. What they mean is that the machine becomes large enough for compounding to finally feel like a character instead of a footnote. Now, here is the part that surprises people most. Halfway to $1 million is not halfway in time. That sentence is worth understanding very deeply. Human beings think linearly. If it took 15 years to reach 500,000, the mind naturally assumes that another 15 will be. That is not how the machine behaves. The first half of the journey is usually slower because your labor is carrying the whole burden. The second half is often much faster because capital has become an active participant. This is what people mean when they say the first 100,000 is the hardest or the first few 100,000 matter disproportionately. It is not merely a slogan. It is describing a real mechanical shift. The first phase is almost all pushing. The second phase contains rolling. That is why the graph bends. People often quit because they judge the whole future by the speed of the earliest stretch. That is a tragic misunderstanding. The first half of the mountain does not tell you the steepness of the entire range. Once the capital becomes large enough, time begins behaving differently. That is why the crossover point matters so much. It is not a finish line. It is a change in physics. And yet even that is not the most important point in the whole journey. It is only the first major turning point. The second turning point is more powerful. That is the moment when the future no longer depends on your contributions at all. That is what many people now call coast fee. The phrase is modern. The arithmetic is timeless. Coast I means you already have enough invested today that even if you never add another dollar, compounding alone should grow the account into your retirement target by your chosen retirement age. That is a staggering idea if you have never seen it laid out properly, because most people think retirement security arrives only when they have the whole pile. They imagine one giant finish line very far away. Work, save, hope, repeat, until someday the number is finally there. That is too crude. There are real transitions long before the finish line. This one may be the most important. It does not mean you are retired today. It does not mean you stop working and become a philosopher on a porch. It means your future no longer depends on you behaving flawlessly forever. It means the plan works even if the contributions stop. That changes pressure. Pressure matters more than most people admit. A household under financial pressure makes very different decisions from a household with optionality. A man who still must save aggressively every year to keep retirement barely plausible experiences his career differently than a man who knows that. Mathematically, retirement will still work even if he never contributes again. The second man can still choose to contribute. He probably should. But now the contribution accelerates or enlarges the future, rather than deciding whether the future exists at all. That is a different emotional world. The second man can leave a job that is destroying him. He can take a lower-paying role that improves his life. He can start a business. He can care for a parent. He can reduce hours. He can say no to humiliations he previously had to endure, because his entire old age plan still depended on one more decade of perfect compliance. That freedom is not luxury. It is pressure relief. Pressure relief is one of the most valuable forms of wealth in existence. Now let us do the arithmetic plainly, because this is where the fog usually lifts. Suppose you want your retirement lifestyle to support $70,000 of annual spending. Not an extravagant fantasy, just a number. Then suppose you estimate that Social Security and other non-portfolio income might provide $25,000 per year. That means the portfolio itself must generate $45,000 per year. Now choose a withdrawal framework. A common rule of thumb is 4%. It is not holy scripture. It is simply a reasonable shorthand for this kind of exercise. If your portfolio must generate $45,000 and you want to think in terms of 4% withdrawals, then you need a portfolio of $1,125,000. That is the finish line for that lifestyle. Now here is the important question. How much would you need today so that, with no more contributions, compounding alone turns today's amount into $1,125,000 by retirement? Suppose you are 30 years away from retirement and you use a real return assumption of 5%, meaning 5% after inflation. Discount the target backward through 30 years of compounding, and the answer lands around $260,000. That is the coast-fi number in this example. $260,000, not because the market is guaranteed, it is not. Not because every decade behaves nicely, it does not. But because time is doing enough of the work that the machine can reach the finish line without fresh fuel. Think about what that means psychologically. A person with that amount 30 years from retirement may still feel behind ordinary, even invisible compared to the financial theater on the internet. And yet, mathematically, he has already crossed into a different class of future. He is no longer working only to rescue old age. He is now working to improve the terms of old age. That is a giant difference. This is why I like clarity so much. The world is full of vague commands. Save more. Invest consistently. Be responsible. Start early. Those things are fine as general advice. They are not enough to calm a human mind. The human mind needs shape. It needs milestones. It needs to know where the important transitions are. Otherwise, the whole journey feels like one long gray tunnel. A tunnel creates burnout. A path with recognizable turning points creates endurance. That is why I prefer milestones to slogans. The first $10,000 matters because it proves the habit is real. The first $100,000 matters because compounding stops feeling entirely theoretical. The crossover point matters because the portfolio begins doing as much work as you do. The moment your portfolio earns more than you can save in a year feels almost surreal. But it arrives for many people if they stay with the process long enough. The coast-I number matters because retirement becomes mathematically possible without more contributions. Then later, the portfolio covers essentials. Then later still, work becomes optional. These are not all the same thing. People flatten them into one giant finish line because flattening is emotionally easy. But flattening also creates despair. A man who thinks only in terms of the distant finish line is much more likely to believe he is failing. A man who understands that he is moving through distinct transitions can see progress much earlier and behave much better. Now, if you hear all this and think, wonderful, another concept that proves I am late, you are hearing it wrong. The point of arithmetic is not humiliation. The point is location. I do not need a person to feel ashamed of where he is. I need him to know where he is. 5. The numbers give you an extraordinary gift time. Time is not a little advantage. Time is the whole unfair miracle. If you are 45, the numbers are still useful because they remove fantasy. They tell you what level of contribution, lifestyle, and return assumptions are required from here. The person who begins late needs clarity even more than the person who begins early. What destroys people is not lateness alone. It is the combination of lateness and vagueness that is fatal. A late starter with clear arithmetic can still build a strong future. A late starter with no clarity usually remains trapped in emotional reaction. So if you are later than you wish, do not ask whether the ideal life was available 10 or 15 years ago. Ask the more useful question. From here, what is my crossover point? From here, what is my coast-I number? From here, what annual spending am I actually targeting? From here, what contribution rate is realistic? From here, what costs can I cut to accelerate the plan without poisoning the present? Those are adult questions. Adult questions create adult outcomes. Now, understanding these milestones changes the role of contributions themselves. Early on, contributions are everything. Later, they become support. Later still, they become acceleration. At the coast-I stage, contributions are no longer the bridge between you and retirement. They are the difference between a decent retirement and a stronger one. They buy margin, they reduce future risk, they enlarge options. That is a wonderful change. But it also creates a new danger. The danger is interference. This is one reason I think the later stage of wealth building is often not about bravery. It is about restraint. Once the machine gets large enough, the owner becomes the main threat again. He feels successful. So he becomes speculative. He feels safe. So lifestyle inflation rushes in. He reaches a meaningful threshold, then raids the account for a bigger house, a new identity, a glorious business idea he does not understand, or a rescue mission for somebody else. That is how people vandalize their own future, not always with one giant explosion, often with emotionally understandable interference at exactly the wrong moment. I do not want to make this sound mystical. It is not. If a person has done the hard work to build a functioning machine, then his job becomes very simple. Stay invested, do not panic sell. Do not let status spending consume the margin the machine just created. Do not get bored and decide the process needs more excitement. Excitement is expensive. Respect the structure. That is the rule. People think the hard part is contribution. Sometimes the hard part is non-interference. That is why I like systems more than inspiration. Inspiration comes and goes. A system remains. Automatic investing remains. Periodic review remains. A simple target remains. A broad index fund remains. These things are not there because the investor lacks imagination. They are there because imagination, untethered from arithmetic, becomes very expensive. The market rewards consistency more than personality. That has always been one of its best features. Now let me say something about work. Most people talk about retirement as though the only question is when they can stop. That is too primitive. A much more useful question is when work stops being survival. That is the deeper transition. The ordinary investor may not retire early in the dramatic sense. Fine. What I want for him is something better than drama. I want him to reach the point where a job loss is no longer a total assault on old age, where a career pivot does not destroy the whole math, where saying yes or no to certain work begins to depend more on the quality of life than on terror about the future. That is what Coast-Fi offers. It does not hand you a beach. It hands you breathing room. Breathing room is deeply underrated. A person with breathing room thinks better, negotiates better, lives better, and sleeps better than a person who is still carrying the whole future manually. I have always admired arrangements that buy calm. Calm is expensive to fake, very valuable when real. That is why I like this concept. It reveals that retirement planning is not one giant race with one giant finish line. It is a series of shifts from dependence toward optionality. At first you are buying the habit, then you are building the first serious mass. Then you reach the crossover point and the capital begins sharing the load. Then you reach the coast point and the future stops depending entirely on fresh sacrifice. Then later, if you continue, the portfolio begins covering essentials. Then eventually the machine covers far more than essentials. Then one day, if you have really stayed in the game and not gotten in your own way, work becomes fully optional. That is a beautiful progression. It is much healthier than the old story that says grind forever and pray. I prefer mathematics that produce hope without fantasy. This does. Now let me close with the only sentence I really want to leave in your mind. There is a moment when retirement stops depending on perfection. It is real. It is measurable. It usually arrives much earlier than people imagine, and once you understand where that moment lives, investing stops feeling like one endless blind climb and starts feeling like the construction of a machine. At first you push it, then it begins pushing with you. Then, if you stay out of its way long enough, it begins carrying far more of the load than you ever could. That is the miracle, not flashy, not magical. Just compounding, time, and an investor disciplined enough to remain present through the years when the process looked too quiet to deserve faith. Those quiet years decide nearly everything. That is what I would want you to remember. There really is a point where your contributions stop being the main thing moving the needle. There really is a point where your existing capital can carry the future. And once you see those points clearly, you stop investing as though you are condemned to grind forever. You begin investing like an engineer building a machine strong enough to one day run with less help from you. That is a far better way to live. It is calmer, it is truer, and in the long run it is usually much more effective. That is all I have ever wanted from money in the first place. Not theater, not a prettier scoreboard. A machine that buys time, lowers pressure, and turns years of quiet discipline into a future that no longer depends on daily heroics. That is what this really is. And once you understand it, the whole journey changes